Just as I get set up, if you want to turn in your Bibles to the book of Romans. And we're in the 11th chapter. So the book of Romans, 11th chapter. So today's message, it's really, it's kind of, how can I put it? It's related to what we've observed here in New Zealand this weekend, Matariki. It's a new holiday to us here in New Zealand. It's a Māori tradition that's now being widely accepted in our country, and we're kind of all new to it. And if you're anything like me, I actually didn't know a whole lot about it until it's been made a holiday here. And I just wonder, does anyone really have an idea about what Matariki is all about? Yes. So Matariki has a lot to do with what's known as Pleiades, the star constellation, which is seen as the Māori New Year, when that star constellation comes into the sky. Yes.
Like mountain myths and stuff. Yeah, like the mountain gods, a lot about the mountain gods and sisters, brothers and sisters.
Well, possibly. I'll read you what I found on an official authoritative website about what it says about Matariki. It says that it's closely connected with the Maramataka, or the Māori lunar calendar. The reappearance of the Matariki stars in the early morning sky brings the past year to a close and marks the beginning of the new year. Mataranga Māori, which is the ancestral knowledge and wisdom, is at the heart of celebrations of the Matariki public holiday, and it will be time for three specific things. And these are three things that we're going to use as a theme throughout this message. The first one being remembrance, so remembering the past. And this is a big part of Matariki. It's honouring those that we've lost since the last rising of Matariki. Secondly, it's celebrating the present, gathering together to give thanks for what we have. And thirdly, it's looking to the future and looking forward to the promise of the new year. So it's those three things in the spirit of Matariki that I want us to kind of concentrate on through this message. But not only that, it goes on to say, historically the stars of Matariki were also closely tied to planting, harvesting and hunting. If the stars appeared clear at night, it signified an abundant season ahead. Matariki is about reconnecting with your home and your whānau. So again, those two things as a kind of a theme through this message as well. The harvest, or the horticultural side of New Zealand, and connecting with family and gathering together. So for today's message, let's take the emphasis towards the past, present and future, as well as the idea of the harvest, or in other words, horticulture and cultivation of plants. In the spirit of Matariki, let's look to the past, take stock of the present with a view to the future, and all the while using this theme of horticulture. And what should become quite obvious, I hope, is that the central message, or the central reasons for all of this, is the gathering together and the connecting of each other. And as an illustration, I've brought along a tree this morning, and this will become more obvious, but right now it probably doesn't make much sense. So here we have, it's an olive tree. And this is quite integral to what we're going to be talking about this morning. I'm actually going to plant this olive tree at home, and I'm going to use this to remind me of this particular year of Matariki and of this worship service today. This is a real honour and a privilege for me to be here and to preach to you. And this is going to serve as a reminder every time I go home and I see that in the garden. Right, so with that in mind, in Romans 11, we'll pick up our reading in verse 22. This is just going to be our central verse, but we're going to kind of chop and change for a few different verses here, and we're just going to really skim over stuff. Let me say from the outset, there's a lot here in Romans 11 that I could go to, but what I'm doing is I'm focusing in on just the central theme of this chapter. And I'm going to miss a lot of stuff, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm trying to get at, or what I'm trying to say. So in verse 22, it says there, "Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but towards thee, goodness. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off." Now this probably sounds quite vague right now, but I hope as the message goes on, it's going to make sense. So Matariki past. Looking to the past and remembering the lost, those that we have lost. With the coming of the Māori New Year and the appearance of the constellation in the night sky, to remember the past, or more specifically, we are to remember those and honour those who have died. If I'm honest, I would say this 12 months has been particularly difficult and has been a struggle for my family in specific. I put aside some time this last Friday just to remember those that I've lost and those that are close to me. Personally, I've lost two beautiful women who are close to me, who I've loved and cherished very much. Most of you will know, be quite aware of this, but our family has lost my wife's mother in a very sudden and in a very sudden illness. And just in the last few weeks, I've lost my very dear Nana. But I also know that some of you have lost some loved ones recently as well. We're not the only ones. And losing that connection, it's tough, isn't it? It hurts, if we're real. And I took some time this Matariki weekend to remember those that I've lost personally and honour them. But we can't help think of those people every day, can we? Those that are very dear to us. You know, because they have special places in our hearts, and when we lose that connection, it's hard. So the Māori, or the Matariki tradition, is to look back and remember those special bonds and connections that we've had that have been lost. This morning, in a sense, I want us to look back at one particular time when a special connection and relationship was lost. Not in the sense that someone lost their life, but in the sense of a relationship being disconnected. Because that's really what this is all about, is connections and relationships and the loss of those. If you look again at what Paul wrote in Romans 11, verse 22, he says, "Behold, therefore the goodness and severity of God, on them which fell, severity, but towards thee, goodness." Now just hold it there for a second. Paul's advice is to behold, it's to look. And he's saying, look at the past. Look at what happened in this instance. And he references here them which fell. That word fell means to fail or to falter. And Paul is saying, look at this example where those people had fell. Who was Paul writing about here? Who were those which fell? Well, if you look back at verse 1, we can see the context of what Paul is saying here. Paul writes, "I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin." So the context here is Israel. Paul is saying those who fell away, or those who fell, that's the nation of Israel. And so if you look at the history of Israel, we know that as a nation they were blessed by God early on. They actually have a very rich history of connection with God. We know from the forefathers of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, they essentially established what we know as the nation of Israel. And their identity was established in following God. We know the stories of Israel, how they were enslaved by Egypt and then later freed again by God through Moses. Israel, we know from the Bible as well as from history, how they experienced their wanderings in the desert until they became to their promised land that we know as modern Israel today. They experienced great blessings under the reigns of King David and King Solomon in that land, but they also suffered great aggression and assault from foreign invaders, leading to great destruction. And despite all that hardship that Israel had suffered over the centuries, God still remained true to the nation in covenant relationship. So despite whatever happened to Israel, their covenant relationship with God still remained. They remained God's chosen people. But that all changed in one instant. If you look at verse 17 of chapter 11, it says there, "And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree." Verse 18, "Boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee." And verse 19, "Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in." Now that might not all make a whole lot of sense, but basically what's happening there is Paul is describing this instance that happened, or this event that happened to Israel. He's describing it in a picture of God's covenant relationship with Israel being an olive tree. And in this instance, Israel being branches of this olive tree, these branches were broken off. Israel in this particular event, where their connection to God was lost. Their branches were broken. So I've brought along some scissors to just demonstrate what's happening here. Is where Israel being connected to God, like branches to a tree, that connection was lost. Just like that. That's what Paul is depicting to us here in Romans 11. Branches losing their connection to the tree. And this is a picture of Israel as a nation being disconnected in covenant relationship with God. This was the Old Testament ending, the branches were severed, and the old covenant ceased, and the relationship Israel shared with God had ended. Branch cut, relationship disconnected. Israel fell, and their covenant with God ended. But it doesn't end there. By no means does it all end there, though, does it? Because again, if you see in Romans 11:22, our central verse, it says here, "Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell," the severity of God on them which fell being the branches broken from the tree, but the goodness of God towards thee, toward thee goodness. So there was a removing of branches, but there was also a grafting in of branches. Do you see that? The severity of God being that the branches removed in their relationship and connection to God, but also branches being grafted in. So this morning I brought along a separate branch to depict just what that is. This is kind of a weedy branch, and I kind of look at it as like depictive of Tony. Tony being grafted in to the tree. Carefully grafted into the olive tree. It actually talks about a wild olive branch, or wild olive branches being grafted in. So the natural branches being taken off and wild branches being grafted in. That being Tony. It's a little weed. Yes. Okay. I just have to get a subtle dig on him while he's not here, you see.
You make sure he watches it, bro.
I hope he does. I think he'll appreciate that. So what this is all depicting, what Paul is picturing to us, is Israel as a nation being cut off from their relationship with God. But on the other hand, access to God in relationship to and with him was opened up. And who was that opened up to? Open up to the rest of the world. Open up to the Gentiles. The disconnection that Israel suffered ushered in a connection for the Gentiles to experience. And who were the Gentiles? Who are the Gentiles? It's us. So the rest of the world, being outside of Israel, now had connection to God, which they didn't have before. So the loss that Israel suffered was the gain that the rest of the world. Paul also writes these words in Romans 9:30. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles, again talking about the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. You see, Israel and their connection to God, it failed. They stumbled in their relationship and they strayed. And they determined to follow God's law more than obeying God. Does that make sense? So they looked at the law that God had given them and they saw their righteousness in that law more than in their righteousness in God. They had gone slightly astray. Things weren't really how they were meant to be. They pursued righteousness through obeying the law rather than in obeying God. And because of that, they terminated their connection and covenant relationship with God. But in doing that, they also opened access to God, to the Gentiles, to us, to the rest of the world. and essentially ushering in the new covenant. A covenant relationship that was no longer limited to and exclusively accessible to the nation of Israel. See, this wasn't a relationship that was determined by heritage or lineage. This is a relationship established and maintained by faith. And that's what Paul is trying to get at here. This is what he's trying to tell the church in Rome and have them understand, is that the old covenant, where it was maintained or it was established on the nation of Israel, well, that had ended. And now a new covenant had been made, which was established and maintained in faith. And there's a big difference there. So what I want us to do there was look back like Paul was, looking back at a time when Israel had lost their connection with God, but that connection had been opened up to the Gentiles. In the spirit of Matariki past, we looked at that, but let's now consider the present. Read with me again Romans 11:22. Behold, therefore the goodness and the severity of God, on them which fell severity, but towards thee goodness. And it's these next words that I want to key in and just hear. If thou continue in his goodness. If you continue in his goodness. See, Paul, he's writing in particular to the churches in Rome here. And he's saying there, the goodness of God will remain if you continue in it. He puts a condition to remaining in that connection with God. He's saying to them, as a church in Rome, if you want to stay connected to God, you have to remain in his goodness. It's not determined by your lineage or your heritage to Israel, but it's actually maintained by his goodness, by God's goodness. So, by all means, let's learn from the past, but let's also take some time to evaluate our standing in the present. You see, what happened a few millennia ago was the fall of the old covenant and the rise of the new covenant. And that's the way it has been ever since then. The new covenant, the New Testament, has grown and thrived in its connection to God. What does that covenant look like today? So this covenant that's now to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world that used to be to Israel, what does it literally look like in this day and age? What is it today? It's his church, isn't it? Jesus established the church a few thousand years ago, and it's still the same today, isn't it? The new covenant, the New Testament relationship with God is his church. It was back then, and it hasn't changed all the while till now. It is his church. Our literal connection with God, while personal and intimate to each of us, is actually ultimately accomplished in his church. The new covenant is a church covenant. Therefore, it stands to reason that connection with God is through a church relationship. I hope that makes sense. And at this point, I'd have you pause to self-evaluate where you are at with your own personal connection with God. How is your own personal connection with God? Because that's what I've done over this last weekend, this Matariki weekend, is I've self-evaluated. How is my connection with God? How is it really? Honestly. Do you even take time to think about your connection with God? If you were to self-evaluate, how well would you say you're going? Because if we really want to know the truth of it, our connection to God is determined by Him, not actually by us. I hope that makes sense, because our connection with God is through Him and His covenant. It's not about us and us maintaining our relationship to Him. It's actually Him and His covenant in relationship to us. I hope that makes sense. Because what I mean by all that is our relationship with Him doesn't look like what we want it to look like. We can't change it. There's not 1,000 different ways to be in relationship with God. There's not 1,000 different ways to connect with Him. There's the branches to the tree. There's the new covenant. Our way of connecting with God today is through His church. So if you're self-evaluating yourself about how are you in your connection with God, and self-evaluating how is my relationship with Him, the time I took over this weekend, I'm not perfect. I never will be. I'm a sinner, and I get things wrong. But regardless of all that, I choose God and His relationship in this church. I choose to be in relationship with Him through His way. And so in self-evaluating, my connection with God is actually in a pretty good place, because I'm here right now. I'm connecting with God right now. And I'm actually living each day in connection with God, because I'm living in this church. Literally living each day in this church. Because if you want to, how we can kind of see it is, I don't know if you realise, but there's actually an attack on relationships in this world as we speak. There's an attack on how we would see relationships, isn't there? The way that we used to look at, the normal, the common family has completely been destroyed. The world would have you think that there's no such thing as a mother and father and children in a nuclear family. They would have you think that it could be anything you like. You determine what a family looks like. There's a real, genuine attack on how we view what a relationship looks like. And do you think it's any different with the church? They would have you believe that you can worship God any way you want. You can do it from the privacy of your own room. You can do it whenever you like. But is that necessarily how God sees His relationship with us? Because then how would the severing of the old branches and the grafting in with the new ones, how does that mean that it can be any way we want? There was a specific way that the relationship with God was in the past with Israel, and those branches were connected to that tree, and that tree fed them. But then with the grafting in with the new branches, the Gentiles being in a covenant relationship with God in a church, well, that was the way to connect with God as well. Well, that was the new way. It's not a whole myriad of different ways. It is the new covenant way, the church way. That is how we worship God. That is how we connect with Him. And if you listen to the world and to social media, they'll have you think that, it could be all manner of different things. But how connected to reality is all of that? I trust in God and what he says. I guess what I want to convey this morning, and at the heart of all of this stuff with the branches connecting to the tree, it really boils down to, doesn't God want a connection with us? Do you see how important a relationship is to us, to God? It's God's desire that we are in covenant relationship with him. He desires to connect with us. And I guess what I want us to evaluate or consider this morning is, how much do we desire to connect with him? How much of a relationship do we want with him? That is the heart of this message. It's God's will that we have a relationship with him. That's what he desires. He wants to connect. Aren't relationships important? Aren't they just so valuable? You know, I see you people here, and I see, you have blood ties with each other, and your brothers and sisters and mothers and sons and daughters, but I see more connections than that. I see more relationships than just blood family. Aren't they important? Don't we desire that? Don't we desire relationships with each other? Don't we want to connect? This kind of brings us to the spirit of matariki future. We've looked at the past and what happened with Israel in the past. We've taken stock of and looked at matariki present and how we are in this present day. But also we need to have a mind on the future in the spirit of matariki, looking forward to the promise of the future. Because Paul wrote these words because he wants the Gentile churches to take heed to what happened to Israel, because what happened to them could happen to us. It's kind of a warning. He's saying, take heed of what happened to Israel, because that can also happen to you. That can also happen to the Gentile church. There are very real consequences to our decisions. The point of looking to the past and considering the present is that we don't lose sight of what we have, so that we can keep it all in perspective. Are we going to stand in faith like Paul wrote? And are we going to continue in the goodness of God? Because that's how we remain connected, isn't it? If you listen to these words that Paul wrote in Hebrews, he says there, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith. You see that word faith? Having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Goes on to say, let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. Are you getting it? There's this theme of faith that Paul is writing about there. He goes on to say, and let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Again, this is Paul talking about the church relationship with God, our new covenant relationship to him. And what he wants us to understand is it's about faith. It's not based on lineage, it's not based on anything else. Our connection to God is based on faith. Israel lost sight of that, and it resulted for them in being disconnected from God. But I do want to just say that in concluding, before finishing this message, that the story doesn't finish for Israel being just cut off from the tree. See, while Israel being the natural branch were removed from the tree, it doesn't finish there. Because Paul goes on to write here in Romans 11 that there will be a time where the Israel will be grafted back in. And that's kind of the advice that he's giving to the new covenant, to the Gentile churches, is that take heed of Israel being cut off, being the natural branch, and you being the unnatural branch put in, because how easy can it be for God to put the natural branch back into the tree? And that will happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. I don't know God's timing, but it will. And that tells me a lot about God's character, because we know that he wants and desires to have a connection with us, doesn't he? He wants to have that relationship. And he is so long-suffering. He's merciful. And he's willing to forgive when we want it. He doesn't write us off. He's full of grace and he's full of mercy when we want it. But that's a story for another time. So in conclusion, I want us to just think about this theme of matariki. Matariki past. We look at the past and what is lost in the past. And we've seen that Israel, like the branches being removed from the tree, they lost their connection to God through their covenant relationship in the Old Testament. But there was a grafting in of a new covenant relationship to the Gentiles, and a relationship based on faith. That is how we connect with God today. It's in his church through faith. It is faith that we accepted God's free gift of eternal life, isn't it? We accepted that salvation, and it's faith that we entered our church relationship as well, isn't it? We trusted enough in him to surrender to the waters of baptism and join a New Testament local New Covenant church like the Lighthouse here today. We had enough trust in God to do that. Well, our covenant relationship, our church relationship, is also maintained through that faith. It doesn't change. It's not through being right. It's not through being perfect. It's not through doing works to maintain our relationship here. It's through continual trust in God. As I reflected over all of these things that I've talked about this morning, I can't help but value the relationships that I have. I have my family members, and I love them, but I also have you as my family as well. You are my church family, and you are incredibly valuable to me, and I don't take that for granted. I have connections with each of you, and I don't want to see that connection lost. And so within myself, I make determinations in myself to maintain my relationship in this church. And I do that by faith. I don't try harder. I just trust harder. I kind of want to conclude this morning's message just with a sort of an announcement. Just in the last few weeks, I've had a connection in my own personal life that I didn't actually think would ever happen. Many of you here who know me quite well know that my relationship with my father that was lost over 20 years ago, about 25 years ago. Literally hadn't had contact with my dad for 25 years, or 20 years. Well, we've connected. Just a few weeks ago, myself and my daughter Evie, we got to spend an evening with my dad when I travelled north for my nana's funeral. We spent an evening with my brother and sister-in-law and their son, and we made some connection. I got to sit next to my dad, and we had the opportunity to talk and laugh, and we genuinely connected. This is literally from over 2 decades of disconnection. And I can tell you it was genuine. It was genuine, sincere connection. On top of that, I got to witness to my dad. I got to share with him that I now spend my life with you. I get to spend my life with Jesus. And he is an integral part of my life. And that's the connection that we all share, isn't it? Our connection is with Jesus. And I wanted him to know that. That was pretty special. That was really special, to connect with my dad like that. Over 20 years, I get to tell him about Jesus. And, my dad, he's expressed that, he's accepted God's free gift of eternal life. And I know I'll get to see him in heaven one day. On top of that, though, he's expressed that he would like to come down and visit me here in Dunedin. And I've told him he's got a whole lot of family that he's yet to meet that he has no idea about. And he's happy to come to church and meet each of you, because you are my connection with God. That's pretty special to me. And you can't tell me that relationships and connections, they're not important, because they are, aren't they? For a lot of us, it's kind of what keeps us going. If we lose connection with each other, or we lose connection with those special relationships, that can have some pretty huge effects on us. But when we have good connections and when we have great relationships with those that we love, our value of life, our standard of life lifts, doesn't it? Is it any different with God? Have you taken the time to think about your connection to him and just how special and how valuable that is to you, but also to him? Isn't that what we desire so much, is connection? So when I look at this olive tree, and when I see it in my garden, it will remind me of Paul's message to the church. It will remind me of the importance of connection and just how valuable relationships are. It will serve to remind me never to take my church relationship for granted. And that's just how I celebrated Matariki this weekend. Cherishing and relishing what I have with you in this place. Thank you for your attention.